Osrednji dio današnjeg programa posvećen je, kao i inače, glavnoj temi ovogodišnjeg festivala Bookstan, a to je Stanje, opsade. Doprinos Delphine Minoui sastoji se od dvaju dijelova. Prvo će biti razgovor, a to je o knjigi The Book Collectors of Daraya, i nakon toga slijedi projekcija filma. Zapravo je etnografski film i vidjet ćete kako izgleda jedna inicijativa usred ratom razorenog sirijskog grada.
Give it to someone from Sarajevo to figure out. It's nice to be back. Thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with Delphine Minoui. When Dahmer told me that this theme of the festival would be siege, and he wanted to know which books might address that, I thought immediately of Delphine Minoui's work, not just the book we're going to talk about today, because all sieges have the people who live through them and the people who observe them, and sometimes those are the same people. But of course, as you know, there's sometimes people who come in from the outside. And Delphine has been doing that in various ways for all of her writing career as an award-winning journalist, sometimes in a more metaphorical sense, in that she's writing about societies which are somewhat closed, or people who don't have an audience. She's the author of a book called I Am Najud, Age 10, Divorced, as well as a book called I Am Writing You from Tehran. And she was able to bring from those deep interviews stories that would not have traveled outside otherwise. And The Book Collector, though, is a story on a whole new level. And it's about an actual siege of a 4-year siege of the city of Daraya, which is one of the oldest cities in Syria, a city known for its sweet wine. Supposedly Paul of the Apostles came from there. And in 2012, it was a hot point for the resistance to the Assad regime. It began with nonviolent resistance, and in response, the Assad regime put the city under a brutal 4-year siege, during which more than 8,000 barrel bombs were dropped. An herbicide was conducted. The city was absolutely destroyed, and it was reduced down to about 8,000 people staying there. And in the middle of this, Delphine Minoui, living in Paris and Istanbul, sees an image on Facebook of 2 guys in Daraya in an underground library, shelving books. And knowing what was going on in Daraya, she just thinks to herself, what in the world is this? And I think that's a good place to start. You know, what happened when you first reached out, and how did you get to the people that were building this underground library?
Thanks for inviting me here today. First of all, it's a real pleasure. It's very emotional to be in Sarajevo to talk about another siege of Daraya. First of all, as a reporter who has been covering the Middle East for the last 20 years, I found myself very frustrated at the beginning of the Arab Spring and the Syrian Revolution in 2011, because very quickly, not only me but other reporters, we faced a big wall. It was impossible to get access to Damascus because we were deprived from press visas. At one point, it became too dangerous as well to enter the opposition-controlled areas in northern Syria. And I was in my office in Istanbul, in front of my screen, my computer screen, and I was wondering, how is it possible to be able to keep on telling a story which became totally invisible and keep it somehow visible to the outside world to understand what's going on inside Syria? So as many other reporters, I started relying on the amazing data we could get access to on the internet, on the social media, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, thanks to those amazing Syrian activists who quickly turned into citizen journalists. In the absence of foreign media, they were the ones telling their own story. So acting, but also reacting and filming what was going through. And so, as you mentioned, one day I was so frustrated, I was flipping through the internet, and I bumped into this amazing photograph of this underground library in Daraya. And I was kind of shocked. How come those guys are still sticking to books and culture through peaceful means in the midst of war? It was at a time when Daraya was facing at least 80 bombs per day. As you mentioned, the city was almost totally destroyed. The city was cut from the world. There was no electricity, no running water, no food, no baby formula for the newborns. And those guys, some of them, instead of taking weapons to go and fight against the Bashar al-Assad regime, they decided to start reading as a refuge. So I wanted to know more. When I saw this picture, there was just a caption. It was mentioned, the secret library of Daraya. So I reached out to the administrator of that Facebook page, which was called Humans of Syria, who kindly put me in touch with Ahmad, who was one of the co-founders of that underground library. You can imagine the difficulties to reach out to him. No electricity, very basic internet, so the line would come back and forth. Through a lot of different connections, I started to get to know Ahmad and his friends, who one after the other came behind my screen and told me the story of how they decided to save 15,000 books in the destroyed houses and abandoned houses of the cities, to gather them and protect them, because that was what was only left from their city. And the best way to protect them was to gather them in a basement, in one of the basements of the city, and that's how they created this underground library.
So, as you mentioned, the books didn't just, none of them were there. I mean, they basically every time a house or a building or something was bombed, they would go through and pick through the rubble and find books and bring them to this location. Can you tell me a little bit about the rescue, the sort of salvage job of bringing those books to there? And how many people were involved in getting the books across town? And it must have been incredibly dangerous to be doing that.
So Daraya used to be a city of around 250,000 people, and at the beginning of the siege, many families left the city, especially women and children. In the middle of the siege, there were still around like 20,000 people, and among these 20,000 people, there were a lot of activists. Some of them decided to take weapons to protect the city and to be on the front lines. And among all of these activists, there was this group of around 40 young guys who decided to go and save those books. It was a very dangerous operation. Actually, they also had a lot of argument between themselves. One of them told his friends, well, what's the point of saving books when we cannot even save lives? But the others were insisting on the fact that, look, it's what's left from our own heritage. And this is important to safeguard somehow what we still have from our own city. And so they started going through different houses, mosques, church, because there was a Christian minority in Daraya as well. Sometimes they would even, because they really had they were really sensitive in the sense that they didn't want to be seen as thieves or looters. So sometimes they would even manage to find out or find the phone number of those who had escaped already from the city. So they would reach out to them, either they would be in exile in Jordan or Lebanon, and ask their permission to enter their house and get access to the books that were totally under the rubble of the houses.
and they wrote the names of the owners of the books in the books, so that the library wasn't just simply a disembodied group of books. It was a group of people's books.
That was so important to them. They, from the very beginning of the siege, they didn't know how long it would last. The war was getting harsher and harsher. They didn't even know if they would survive. Many of their friends died during the siege. But they kept in mind that those books, at the very beginning, belonged to some people. And at one point, the war will end up. And they really wanted to give back those books to their owners. So in order to be able to give back the books, they decided to write down on the first page of each volume a number and the name of the owner. And that was very fascinating for me, because again, they were in the middle of the war, but they always had this goal about like sticking up to life, thinking it will be over one day, and thinking that in the middle of this chaos, to remain sane, to remain human, they had to keep their life under a certain order or a certain routine. So what I discovered as I was talking to them, as well as they were sometimes sending me some pictures, some videos through the internet, one day they sent me a video and I was like, wait a minute, I stopped on the video and I saw that on one of the walls of the underground library, they had put specific rules, any rules you could find in any library around the world. I mean, maybe same rules as you could find in New York Library, about how you have to make sure you give back your copy back on time, like 2 weeks later. How, when you sit and read your books, you have to respect the silence of other readers. And imagine, this is a city where the bombs are still dropping. But again, it was for them a way to safeguard a space. This was kind of this library became kind of their safe haven, an underground university where they would be able to gather, meet, and preserve what would be left from the life when death would be at any corner of the city.
Like every library, they also have a kind of, at least the libraries in New York City have this best or most checked out list, where you see what people are reading a lot. And, I thought they would be reading Dostoevsky or Mahmoud Darwish. And the number one book for them was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Men Are from Mars and Women Are from Venus. So could you just talk a little bit about why these 2 particular self-help books were so revelatory to them?
I was so surprised myself, and to be honest, I never read Stephen Covey before. And thanks to them, I started flipping through the books, and I was like, wow, this is really hard to digest. It's like a very heavy book, and this is something you read for self-help issues, or like how to deal with your manager, with your partners. And how come those guys are reading such a book in Daraya under the bombs? And again, they told me that was a way for them to survive, to stick to reality, to give certain goals to their lives. Because at the end of the day, the war would end up and they would have to go back to a normal life. So this book, not only they read it, it was the most read book inside the library. Of course, beside other books, including a book on the siege of Sarajevo, by the way, as well as The State of Siege by Mahmoud Darwish that they had found in one of the houses. So not only they read the book, but for their friends who didn't have time to read, because some of them didn't have time to read, because among the common visitors of the library, there were also frontline fighters who would come quickly and go back to the front lines. So those guys would come, and because they didn't have time to read the book, they would follow lectures on the book. So you had like one of the professors teaching the 7 habits to his friends and to the young activists.
And they made samizdat copies of it, where 7 pages would be kind of beveled, in really small font onto one page, so that they could have 2 copies or 3 circulating.
Exactly, because when they went through all the houses, they found books, but sometimes they found also good equipments that they could use including a printer and a photocopy machine. So they made photocopies of this book, but to save paper, because they didn't have so much paper, they would like print it out in like very, very tiny letters. And by the end of the siege, it was almost impossible to read through the pages because it was like so much underlined and like damaged by, you know, going from someone to another.
Yeah, the book becomes, the library becomes a kind of window into the various ways that this group of Syrians survived the siege. And you talk about other things that they do. You know, it becomes a very creative time. They start literary journals. They start a mini TED Talk series out of the library. And you said they start changing language and come up with new words to describe the improvisational ways that they have to come up with things, because they have no running water, no flour, no electricity, no ability to run around at daylight. They can't get together usually with their wives or partners. So can you talk a little bit about some of the other creative ways that they manage to survive mentally in this time, in addition to the library?
There are so many means of surviving and very creative, by the way. So they learned, because they were totally cut from outside, and even the UN convoys were targeted by the regime. So at one point they could barely eat, only one daily meal from tree leaves that they would find in the streets and boil. So they would have like this daily basic soup. But they were even creative about it, because sometimes they would gather and spend hours at night dreaming about the amazing stuffed zucchinis that their mother would use to cook, and the amazing juices and pastries that their grandmother would make. They also learned how to grow vegetables in front of the houses, but sometimes their tomatoes would turn into, I don't know, other vegetables, because they didn't know which seeds to use. One of the groups decided also to create, because they needed to refresh their minds all the time, so they created a football ground. And whenever the bombs would stop dropping, they would get out of the basement and play football. They had different teams. One of the guys, who was nicknamed the Banksy of Syria, started going through the destroyed walls of the houses and drawing on those walls. It was often with also ironic slogans. Humor was kind of a shield for them. They used humor to keep on making fun of themselves. And this humor was also used in one of the magazines. They created a magazine during the siege, which they called Karkabe. Karkabe is kind of a slang word for cows. And it was again a way to oppose their narrative, their peaceful narrative, to the very propaganda narrative from Bashar al-Assad's regime. Because he used to always have this slogan when he would come on TV. He would say, "It's me or cows." And he would use the word fauda. So they used this word Karkabe as an opposition to fauda. So they used a lot of play on words. And this Karkabe magazine was aimed to give a little bit of more hope and distraction to the population of the city. So you would have articles about the news, about what was going on outside of Daraya in other cities, like Aleppo, Homs, even Damascus, the capital. There were articles about history, articles about sports, football. And at the end of each issue, they had crosswords, and they also had like a horoscope. But instead of using the astrological signs, they made fun and created their own signs out of war words. So you would have the signs called Kalashnikov, another sign called checkpoint, another sign called barrel bomb. And the advices they would give were according, it was like a joke for themselves, according to what kind of life they were going through. So for instance, one of the advice was about, okay, if tomorrow you're invited for a cup of tea at your neighbor's house, you'd better eat before, otherwise you are going to starve from death. Or another advice was, okay, if tomorrow you have to dig another tunnel, don't worry, maybe one day you'll end up finding a treasure. So on a daily basis, it was always all about making fun of yourself as a way of survival as well.
There's something that will bring back some memories for those who've come to various book stands. There's a man in the book. The book is kind of a series of portraits of people who are part of this library, named Shadi, who's a photographer, and he becomes obsessed with taking pictures, capturing the moment that these barrel bombs are being dropped, and he films them, and gets very, very close to them, and it reminded me of Rawi Haj, who came here 5 or 6 years ago, a novelist who during the Beirut Civil War became a photographer and was taking pictures of bombs dropping. And I wonder if you can talk about that mixture of humor and also witness, and if there were points at which the two could combine. You know, that a self-reflexive humor is a way of looking at yourself, but there must have been parts of survival that really couldn't be funny, you know, such as what Shadi was doing.
Definitely, what Shadi was doing was so important to him and to his friends as well. They were aware that they were totally cut from the world, that outside there, and imagine Daraya is so close to Damascus. Actually, Daraya is sort of an enclave. There's a mountain in front of them. It's like 5 kilometers from Daraya, and it's Bashar al-Assad Palace. So imagine every day Bashar al-Assad could open his window and see what was going on, and he could watch the bombs being dropped on the citizens of Daraya. But every day would go on TV, and he would keep on the same narrative, calling those guys terrorists, Islamists, jihadis. So those guys had a point. They wanted to tell the outside world that they were not terrorists. They had peaceful means. So the only way they could rely to was to document their daily life and to film themselves. Not only film their life, but film the violence they were facing every day. So that was one of the goals of Shadi. Every day, he would get out of the basements, go through the city at big risk. He got injured many times. He faced death many times. He lost some of his friends. But to him, that was his point, to immortalize a 4-year siege that nobody would have known about if they couldn't document it. And whenever they would have the most tiny connection on the internet, they would download those videos. They had their own Facebook page to be able to tell the outside world what was going on inside Daraya.
You know, you mentioned Homs and Aleppo, South Aleppo, and Homs were both under siege as well. Mm-hmm. Was the point of a siege is not its rationality, obviously. It's just the brutal fact of it. But was there some reason why the Assad regime was particularly obsessed with this place? Was it because it began as a nonviolent protest? Or was there some other aspect that you found in the covering of it that you thought, this is why he's determined to break this place?
I mean, as war went on in Syria, we realized, reporters who were covering Syria, that it was something very repetitive and most probably planned by the Syrian regime. It was sort of like a demographic engineering, emptying cities which were the nest of the revolution, where the peaceful revolution started. And indeed, like symbolic cities like Homs and Daraya were part of them. Daraya has a specific history as well. Daraya in the 90s was known for his very peaceful activist movement. Back then it was under the father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad. And it was a time facing a lot of repression, where even one tiny demonstration out of 5 people would be quickly banned. So a group came out back then. They used to call themselves the Shebab of Daraya, the youth of Daraya. The only safe place they would be able to gather was a mosque. So they would gather in a mosque, and as a matter of fact, they created a library back then already in this mosque. They would gather and think about peaceful means. And they launched a series of peaceful initiatives to try to find a way to express themselves despite the censorship, despite the restrictions. So for instance, they launched initiatives like related to how to make your city more clean, so gathering garbage around the city, how to fight against people smoking cigarettes. At one point, they also mobilized when the American war started in Iraq in 2003, and so they organized gathering to talk about war. So this spirit of Daraya was, it's like seeds you put on the ground. So it was inside the city when the revolution started. And what was interesting is when the revolution started, it's mostly the new generation who went out to the streets. So those young guys were 18, sometimes 16 years old. And at one point in the gatherings, in the demonstrations, they find themselves facing the other generation. And this is the combination of these two generations that was left inside Daraya during the siege. I think, so that's why the regime really wanted to make a point to destroy this peaceful revolution to be able to stick to his narrative about terrorists. And another main reason was also very strategic. Daraya is based just next to the Meze military airport, which was a very strategic point for the regime. So Bashar al-Assad really was hoping to destroy totally the city in order to move, either to turn the city into, let's say, military barracks, or at one point to move his own loyal people to the city.
The surprising thing that you write about in the book is that in the middle of this 4-year siege, most life is underground. Daraya manages to repel Daesh, which comes as a kind of liberating force, and say, we'll come and protect you, but they have obviously other designs, and they maintain for a very long time, maybe even to the end of the siege, a kind of representational council government that is above the military, above the fighters. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that meant in the context of this library. Is it a culture? Did the city itself have a kind of culture of public commons, if you will?
That was, by the way, a very unique experience in all Syria. I mean, very quickly, either in Aleppo or other cities, the military took over the civilian organization. They used to call them the local councils. So very quickly, different battalions started decide for the civilians. But Daraya always managed to keep the civilians above the military. So the local council had a very, very important role. And by the way, I mean, it was a real experience of self-governance. It was a mini, I mean, that's what I mentioned at one point in the book, it's like a mini commune, like what happened in France back then. They learned through their own experience about democratic rules. Not only they created a city council which supervised the military, their own military men, but also they had regular elections so that the boss will not always be the same boss as what was happening with the regime. And so this local council was supervising everything, the military, the distribution of water, of food, the library, as well as even attending to the widows of men who would have been killed. They supervised the cemetery. At the beginning, there was only one cemetery, then 2 cemeteries. They supervised the field hospital because the hospital was destroyed. And something very important, they also supervised the schools. There were 2 schools during the siege run by women. Women couldn't take too many risks to get outside of their houses, of their basement, because they had to take care of the children first, and second of all, they had to protect themselves. But they would create holes between different basements and gather the kids every day to organize underground schools and to keep up again with a normal life.
What do you think is, if possible, it's possible to learn by looking at sieges comparatively? You know, everyone is so individually experienced, and yet there are certain strategies of punishment and destruction and strategies of survival that pop up in various sieges. And I wonder what the men of Daraya who you were speaking to, what they told you that they learned other than keep going, survive, you know, this will end. What did they learn from reading about Sarajevo, for example?
You know, they felt so isolated at the beginning, and many of them thought about giving up and just escape, leave Daraya. But indeed, they found solace through the books they read, because books they started reading were a way to find a refuge, but also a way to escape. By the way, as a parenthesis, what's very interesting to me is most of those guys hated reading. They were not bookworms back then. They really, like, some of them never had touched one book in their life, because to them a book was a symbol of propaganda, of dictatorship, of what they were forced to read by the regime. But when they bump into books about the siege of Sarajevo, or books by Mahmoud Darwish, it helped them to survive in a way that they realized they were not the only ones in history to face such a brutality. Because again, these were young guys. They were 18 years old. They had no clue, no idea about other countries, what was going on outside of their own country. And they had no idea that siege had happened through history in other parts of the world. So when they started reading those books, they could relate to other human stories. And it gave them hope. It made them realize that there's an end. At the end of the tunnel, there may be light. And even if it's risky, even if it's dangerous, it's worth fighting for, looking for this light. And as Ahmad often mentioned, so the main co-founder of the library, I remember he used to always repeat this sentence, like almost like a mantra. He used to tell me, look, you know, we can destroy a city, but we cannot destroy ideas. And I think that was very important for them to stick to that goal, make the ideas survive.
We're going to watch a film of the book collectors in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you one or two last questions here, and invite you to ask one yourselves if you have one, of Delphine. And my question is, amazingly, all of this was reported through WhatsApp, and obviously, you know, in almost every single case in the world, it's far superior to have someone go to the place that they're writing about. And in the case that in this case, it was impossible. I wonder if you can just meditate for a little bit about what was lost by having to write that way, but also what possibilities it opened up to you as a reporter?
Honestly, it was very challenging. It was, I would say, even harsher than when you're on the ground and you report, when you meet people for real, because you always think there's something maybe hidden that you don't see through your computer screen. In war, there is a violent war, but there's also the communication war. We are witnessing it today with Russia and Ukraine. And so there was a propaganda coming out from the regime, but there's always a propaganda on the other side as well, on the opposition side. And I didn't want to fall in any trap. I had to make sure those guys were real peaceful guys. I had to make sure they didn't kill anyone. So it required a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of fact-checking. So for 4 years, I spent days and nights talking to them, calling them back, harassing them with so many questions. At one point, one of them thought I was a spy because when I was asking also about like their military commanders, I would need the names, the names of the battalions, etc. And they were wondering why. It was like, when you have different pieces and you have to bring back everything into a puzzle, being aware that there will always be like sort of black boxes you would never be able to have access to. But I think it was still worth it. It was still better than nothing. Because if you don't write about what's going on, then it's a victory for the regime. It's a victory for the dictatorship. That's what they aim for. They want to cut, Bashar Assad wanted to cut this city from the world. So, in a way, I mean, I didn't reach out totally to my goal because I remember from the very beginning when I was talking to these guys, I was telling them, hopefully one day the war will be over. I'll come to visit you in Daraya. I'll bring the book once it's published and it will be an extra book inside the library. I could never go there because at the end of the siege, they were forced to escape in 24 hours. Today, Daraya is a ghost town. The library is totally destroyed. It was looted by the regime soldiers. Ironically, they didn't destroy the books. They went, it's even worse. It shows how the culture for them is just worth nothing because they went to a flea market in Damascus and they sold their books for nothing. But there's always light, and which makes me feel good about it, and I think that's why it was important to tell the story, because it's also a story about resilience and resistance through cultural means. Some of their friends found the books at the flea market in Damascus, and because the books had a number and the name of their owners, the friends in Damascus tried to reach out to the owners. And when they found the owners, for those who had survived, for those who had not been tortured in jail, or for those who hadn't been killed, they decided to send them back to them. So as we are talking today, those books managed to escape. Some of them managed to escape from the siege, and some of those books are traveling, reaching out Beirut, Amman, Istanbul. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor of the power of the words, you know. You can totally cut a city from the word, but books and words are still capable of traveling.
And all the various founders of the bookstore have left. You know, obviously two of them are in Paris. Several are in Turkey. And one of the comments of one of them, of course, after they've left Daraya, you were able to finally meet them, and you meet them in various states. And one of them says to you, suddenly everything's permanent again. It's like it's going to last forever. Our notions of time, space, everything have changed. Life is organized, and there's no fear, no danger. Everything's so disconcertingly simple. And I wonder, before we meet the the book collectors of Daraya in this film, if you can say anything about them now, you know, how they're dealing, and if you could ever conceive of writing a kind of sequel, because they've all gone on and done really interesting, different things.
So being together in Daraya, it was, for them was a story of survival through the means of books, but through building an amazing friendship. And what's beautiful, what we will see in the documentary I made with them, is how they managed to save this amazing friendship. And now that we are talking, they are scattered all around the world. Some of them are still in Syria, in the last corner run by the opposition in northern Syria, in Idlib. Some of them actually have created a mobile library. Some of them are living by the border on the Turkish side. And as you mentioned, 2 of them are now in Paris. So after this collective dream of building up a better Syria, a better future, of course, they lost a lot. They lost their revolution, they lost their dear country, they lost their library, they lost their city. For some of them, they lost some of their dear ones. One of the book collectors got killed, Omar. But to them, it's time for each of them to rebuild themselves, to get ready for the future. Let it be in 10 years, 20 years, because they still have their dream to go back to Syria. So for them, the best way now to think about the future is to educate themselves, to keep up with which was what their goal during the siege of Daraya. So many of them went back to their studies. Ahmad and Shadi, who are now in Paris, are studying how to be professional cameraman. Another one, Hussam, who is still by the Syrian border in Turkey, is working with a Syrian NGO with what it's called the white helmets, the civilian defense, which is still working inside Syria whenever they are facing Russian bombings and Syrian bombings. They are finding ways to rescue people and help people. Some of them got married. Life is back as well. Some of them fell in love. They have girlfriends. But what is very interesting is all of them learned deeply from their own experience, from the war, and from the books they read. And every time I meet them, we created a Facebook, a WhatsApp group together. So it's like a mini tiny library with notes. We always share ideas, reading ideas. And what I love with this interaction is I used to give them suggestions, but now they are the ones giving me most of the suggestions because they read a lot. They are real bookworms.
That's a lovely place to end. Does anybody have a question for Delphine about her book or the book collectors, about her experiences in Syria? It's always like this. Don't worry. It's not just you. It's if no one has a question, we can go to the film, and you can meet. Is Omar in the film?
Sadly, because actually, maybe to give you an idea about these documentaries, so as I was telling you, the book was really aimed to immortalize this story and to remember in terms of, like, when people will read about Syria in 10 years, 20 years, to remember that, sure, it turned into war. At one point, all we talked about when we talked about Syria was either talking about the Damascus regime or about Daesh, the jihadis, the extremists. So the book was aimed to remember these, what I call the third voice, those guys, those civilian guys, who were actually, ironically, the first voice at the beginning of the revolution. And then when Shadi, who was the first one escaping from Syria to Turkey at the end of the siege in 2016, when Shadi came to Turkey and I met him out there, I will always remember that day. He came with 2 bags, one with his computer, which he had managed to save, and one full of the data, the video data he had saved from the siege. All these videos on, external hard drives, full of all these images that the regime wanted to erase. So we spent weeks and months to go through these videos, these images. And at one point it struck me. It was like something that was crystal clear to me. The story was not over. I mean, the way to tell the story about Daraya was not over. They had this amazing material, very precious. We had to do something with this material. So I offered them to make a documentary by filming them today in their daily life as they are trying to get back to their normal life, and going through as a flashback to the siege of Daraya, to the amazing history of their library. So that's what we are going to see.
So I think do you just press play, I guess?